first, the reality. When the Battle of Kyiv happened and that giant convoy of military vehicles advanced on Kyiv and then just stopped because they forgot food and fuel, that's when in Washington and in London and in Paris and in Berlin and the rest, we realized we were facing a different sort of conflict than what we thought we were preparing for.
When did this convoy stop?
This was the first week of the war. We thought that the war would be over in 1 to 6 months, and that was a reasonable assessment. That was mine as well. And the Russians would eventually then push on the next line of countries, which includes 5 NATO members, and we would have a confrontation between NATO and the Russians on something close to the Cold War border, where we would find out exactly what U.S. foreign policy was.
Ukraine is continuously shocking the world, and it's only getting started. That's the latest prediction from geopolitical expert and strategist Peter Zyyhan. When the Russian army launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the world expected a swift and overwhelming victory for Russia. After all, Russia boasted one of the world's largest and most well-equipped militaries. The assumption was that Ukraine, a country that had struggled with political instability and had a much smaller military, would fall quickly. Western nations, including the US, anticipated that the war might last a few months, after which Russia would turn its attention to other former Soviet states, including NATO members, leading to a potentially dangerous confrontation with the West. But something happened that no one expected. With determination and unexpected skill, the Ukrainian forces managed to stop the Russian advance. The Battle of Kyiv, in particular, became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. A massive convoy of Russian military vehicles, stretching for miles, was advancing towards Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. It seemed like the fall of Kyiv was close. However, the convoy suddenly stopped because of a logistical disaster. The Russians had miscalculated, running out of fuel, food, and other essential supplies. The Ukrainian forces exploited this mistake, using conventional and unconventional tactics, forcing the Russians to retreat. In a recent interview, geopolitical expert Peter Zyyhan reveals why the battle between Russia and Ukraine will not be predictable. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where we will break down Peter's insight about the ongoing war and the tactics each nation is using. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy economics, geopolitics, and history, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Now, let's jump in with this interview with Peter Zyyhan.
Let me start with the reality of the situation, then go into why we're talking about abandoning or cutting back aid, because it's really not serious talk. So first, the reality. When the Battle of Kyiv happened and that giant convoy of military vehicles advanced on Kyiv and then just stopped because they forgot food and fuel, that's when in Washington and in London and in Paris and in Berlin and the rest, we realized we were facing a different sort of conflict than what we thought we were preparing for. We thought that the war would be over in 1 to 6 months, and that was a reasonable assessment. That was mine as well. And the Russians would eventually then push on the next line of countries, which includes 5 NATO members, and we would have a confrontation between NATO and the Russians on something close to the Cold War border, where we would find out exactly what U.S. foreign policy was. Since the second W. Bush term, American foreign policy on NATO has been very flimsy, and Trump made it very clear unofficially that if he was reelected for his second term a couple years back, he was going to pull out of NATO formally on day one. Then you'd have a very different situation with the Europeans unprepared to face down the Russians and having to decide whether they were going to kowtow or what. When the Ukrainians proved that they, who functionally didn't have a military a decade before, could stop the Russians cold and stop what was probably the second largest armed force to march in post-Cold War history, the number one being the U.S. assault on southern Iraq during Desert Storm, that you could have this ragtag bunch of guys on four-wheelers basically stop the Russian army. That changed the math, because if there's anything we know about the Russians, is that for them to feel that they are safe, they have to be able to plug access to their territories. And that means reaching the Danube Delta, and that means reaching the Vistula, which is in downtown Warsaw, and that means means eliminating the Baltic states. So that's 5 NATO countries right there in the crosshairs. We know they're coming for them eventually if they can. And if you had Ukraine fall and a more or less force of equals, then, by Cold War rubric, we understand what happens with a force of equals. There's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of preparation, and there's diplomacy. But if the Russians were having problems taking on Ukraine, which was a basket case, then all of a sudden our assessment of the Russian military is very, very different. And so if they can succeed in Ukraine, what comes up on the Russian border is a mess. Their needs haven't changed. It's their capacity that has. And if they know they're not an equal force, they're just going to use nukes. The decision was made across all of NATO in the first month of the war that we have to prevent the Russians from ever reaching the border, the Russians from ever facing NATO in a direct confrontation where the nukes would immediately fly. And so every weapon system that the Ukrainians can prove that they can operate and maintain, very big detail there, Germans were very specific on that, everything that they can operate and maintain, they can have, and everything else is details. That's where everyone's coming from. What's going on in the United States is that all the serious people who can find Canada on a map and can do basic mathematics understand this and are behind it. So if you go and you talk to the Republican presidential candidates, whether it's Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Ron DeSantis, they're all more or less on board with that understanding. Ramaswamy is, God, somebody needs to fill that void. Why not him? But in doing so, he's saying some ridiculous things. It appears to be the path that we're on now. Each weapon system is different. And as the Ukrainians like to say, they don't have a military, they have a petting zoo of military equipment, because everyone has given them their cast-offs and their hand-me-downs, and a lot of it is not interoperable. We went through a really, really knockdown, drag-out fight within NATO in the 90s and the early 2000s, not just with the new members from the old Soviet bloc, but our old members, guys, none of our stuff works together. And let's be honest, our stuff is better than your stuff. So you need to make some decisions here. Either you modify your stuff so it's interoperable, we have a simpler logistics system, or you buy our stuff. One of the things that came out of that was the Joint Strike Fighter. So a central platform. That means that everyone who chose to go with the upgrade option has a lot of old stuff, and they just gave it all to Ukraine. So eventually, we're all going to run out of hand-me-downs, and we're either going to have to provide the Ukrainians with frontline equipment, or we're going to have to do a massive defense buildup to either overhaul allies with newer stuff, and they can give their older stuff, or to do a defense buildup to build the older stuff. And all of those decisions are different based on which country you're in and which equipment you're talking about. But that is very much in play right now.
Ukraine's military situation is unique. As the Ukrainians joke, they don't have a military. They have a petting zoo of military equipment. Countries have given them their old gear, stuff they don't use anymore. The problem is that not all this gear works well together, making things complicated. In the 90s and early 2000s, NATO members had a similar problem. They all had different gear that didn't work together. Eventually, they figured it out, and projects like the Joint Strike Fighter came out of that mess. A standardized platform for everyone. But Ukraine's situation is different. They're relying on whatever they can get, and eventually we will run out of hand-me-downs to give them. When that happens, we'll have to make some tough choices. Do we give them our best frontline equipment, or do we ramp up our defense production to build more old stuff to give them? Every country in NATO faces this question, depending on the specific equipment and the country's military needs. Let's get back to Peter Zyyhan as he discusses this further.
They never even made the candidacy list, which is usually the start of a 10 to 15 year process to apply for membership. Remember that if you want to become a NATO member, everyone has to approve, every single country has to approve of you becoming a candidate, and then every single country has to approve the negotiations at every step of the process, and then everyone has to ratify with their Congress or Parliament membership. So it's not like the United States just made a wild decision here. We hadn't even gotten to step 1 of 20 in the accession process. There's something called the Partnership for Peace program, which we built in the 1990s to try to convince the Russians that we really didn't want a confrontation. So all the former members of the Soviet Union were invited to join, and the Russians did, and Ukraine was on that list as well. And basically it's things like civilian control over the military, teaching the military about human rights and why you don't use AK-47s to plow through protesters, that sort of things. Whether it's the Praetorian Guard or the Janissaries or the Gurkhas, you've got this force that is independent of the official structures, that reports only to the leader, that is stable, and it contributes to the strength of the state until it doesn't. And what happened was it just stopped. And so Prigozhin basically found himself unable to elicit Putin's backing to become more powerful and to take over the defense ministry. That's ultimately what he was after. And so he decided to take matters into his own hands, and he captured a city and made a bid for Moscow in order to force Putin's hand, and he got killed for it. There's still a lot of debate and armchair generaling going on both sides. My best understanding from the people that I discuss with, and they probably wouldn't be happy with me phrasing it the way that I am, is it's, okay, so we had about 60,000 Ukrainian troops almost for a year training with NATO on combined arms conflicts. So the way that Russia faces a force is they just pulverize the target with artillery and then move in mass numbers of conscripts and disposable troops to soak up the mines and the ammo and just try to human wave it. That's the Russian strategy.
So, why is this important? Now, every piece of military equipment that goes to Ukraine is tracked and accounted for. Congress gets regular briefings on what's happening, and there's full transparency about where it comes from. Yet, some politicians still lie about what's happening, even though they have the information right before them. Nothing in the last 30 years has been more important for American security than keeping Ukraine alive. Let's ignore the moral case for a moment. They're fighting a war with a nuclear power so that we don't have to. This is a win-win situation. In Russia, things aren't looking so good either. Historically, Russian power structures have always had this element of instability. There's usually some force outside the official government structures that are supposed to report directly to the leader, like a Praetorian Guard. That worked fine until it didn't. Recently, we saw what happens when that balance is disrupted. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a failed caterer, before becoming a warlord, tried to take over the Russian Defense Ministry. When he didn't get Putin's backing, he made a move on Moscow and got killed for it. It was a bold move, but not a smart one. He wasn't the brightest person in Russia, just one of the more ruthless. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for Ukraine, but for the world. If Ukraine can hold off Russia, it will change the balance of power in Europe and beyond. But if they fail, we could be looking at a much darker future, where the threat of nuclear war becomes all too real. So, supporting Ukraine isn't just about helping a country defend itself, but preventing a global catastrophe. And that's why it matters. What do you think of these developments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more updates and analysis as we track this critical story.